The truth. It is impossible to conceive of objectivity without at the same time thinking of a system of truth, in the name of which objectivity can present itself as such. Without it, objectivity is only a contingent expression of subjectivity. Objectivity is not only defined as the general meaning of experience, but also as the true meaning of experience, or even as a necessary and sufficient structure by which all experience is defined. Outside of it, there is no status for true experience. Objectivity, it is not only limited to being a structure, it is also a value. It refers to something which is not it and which is the truth. This value can be the foundation of the structure. It can be what without which this structure would not exist. Then objectivity appears as an aspect of truth, as a form of truth, which would be on the scale of human experience. Hence a converse relationship. Truth may owe its existence of value only to the structure of objectivity, and an objectivity which, by realizing it, is given with the status and existence of right. This will be in the investigation of the field of objectivity what the system of truth will reveal itself to be. By giving objectivity a restrictive definition, Kant necessarily had to conceive of this objectivity encompassed in a broader truth, in a limitless field of which it would be a particular structure. If there is objectivity only in and through the conjunction of a sensible intuition with a concept, it must be admitted that a non-sensible intuition, or a concept without intuition, falls outside the domain of objectivity, and that to the extent that they aim for it, they miss this form of the truth that is objectivity. But it remains nonetheless that this blind concept, these thoughts without content which are empty, intuition concepts which are blind, has the truth of the blind concept, that is to say, of the concept whose object cannot fall into the field of experience, of this truth which does not have the status of objectivity, but which is nonetheless the truth. In short, Kant cannot exclude from objectivity a certain number of possibilities of thought, unless he confers on them, more or less implicitly, a certain form of truth. He recognizes them not as what they claim to be, but at least the fact of their pretension. Objectivity in Kant therefore tends constantly to be surprised by a broader truth, the truth of what it excludes, which has this, that it will never become experience of the truth. For example, the theory of the thing itself, the relations of reflective judgment with experience, these are the signs always equivocal of this truth, which surpasses objectivity and envelops it like a universal field of a particular structure. The system is therefore oriented not towards the limitation of truth, but in the domain of truth, towards the limitation of a particular truth. So that this limiting system can only invoke as a criterion of its truth the truth that it leaves outside of itself. The truth of exclusion rests only on the truth of the excluded, which remains in Kant's last years the outline of a reversal towards the notion of the constituting self. Fichte had already surpassed Kant in this perspective, and it is internally to the system that he attempts to find truth. It is in the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity that truth can be constituted. Without appealing to any external criterion, the science of science must establish a principle which is verified by itself, or rather by its development in a complete system. It is justified by developing its principle, which reveals one by one the necessary forms of intelligence. Wissenschaftslehre, science pedagogy. It is capable of constituting the whole, a closed set which distinguishes it from the particular and indefinite sciences. It is because this totality is constituted that the doctrine of science is true. But this paradox of a system which constitutes a truth which is valid for it may well hide at bottom a very real contradiction. If it is Wissenschaftler, science pedagogy, which constitutes the truth itself, then the latter can only be valid as a criterion for the scientific presuppositions which the activity of a self poses from the fundamental principles. Truth as a guarantee is only valid at the level below that where it is constituted. Even if we consider it as an absolute freedom, this constituting activity cannot have a truth, in the name of which we admit or pose it. For Fichte there is a truth of freedom even more fundamental than freedom, and which the latter cannot in any way account for. It is this more fundamental truth that Fichte makes no room for, this truth which allows for us to constitute our system. The freedom granted to any reflexive moment is not enough to give status to the philosopher who rejects on science, to the philosopher who needs a truth in order to think his system. Fichte did not reserve a place for himself in the Wissenschaftslehre. Between the two terms, a Fichtean truth defined internally between subject and object, a Kantian truth defined as an limitation domain, the Phenomenology attempts a solution which, beyond this difficulty, must resolve the question posed by the ambiguous notion of objectivity as conceived in Hegel's own system. From the outset, the duality of the notion of objectivity excludes a monism of truth, which would allow for the entire development of the system a single criterion to prevail, exclusive of all distinction. More precisely, if it is true that the naive objectivity of immediate consciousness is not the stable objectivity of the mind, then, on one hand, a single and totalitarian truth would suppress, like an illusion, one of these two forms of objectivity, and on the other hand, because of their dependence, the other would disappear at the same time. Thus, we would be dealing with a truth without objectivity, with this pure idealism which locks itself in the vanity of this abstract and empty world that everything is its own. In the same way, an objectivity without truth would not rise above the consciousness of its objects with a painful consciousness of its contingency. The particular event, the chance of experience, would be taken for the universal truth, and when, with becoming this false universality, this bad infinity of the sensible, would vanish, consciousness would not be able to be overcome the pain which is expressed in duration by God is dead. At the level of what we have called constituted objectivity, it is therefore necessary to admit a truth flexible enough not to disappear totally with the disappearing moments of objectivity, and which, however, does not immediately dissipate this objectivity like an illusion. In other words, constituted objectivity must carry with its truth a truth which is adequate to it, and in no case exceed it or allow itself to be exceeded by it. This truth is a truth for the consciousness of objectivity, and for this consciousness alone. It is certainty more than truth, that is to say, the knowledge of the immediate or of being. It is from this certainty that the truth must be constituted, which will be the certainty that what constituting objectivity is to constituted objectivity. The constitution of a truth seems all the more difficult since certainty consists in the fact that it takes itself for the truth, that adequate to this illusory consciousness, there is no reason for it to go beyond it. But the immediacy of certainty nevertheless implies that it is identical to the consciousness of being certainty, to the consciousness consequently of being reality, since to be certain is to be certain of reality. This certainty in the second degree, this consciousness of certainty, is consciousness of the reality of this certainty. Thus, beyond immediacy of the certain consciousness of its object, a consciousness is revealed which has left this immediacy, which grasps certainty in reality, which it was not itself, since it is only for immediate consciousness. Thus disappears monism, the illusory imperialism of certainty, which seemed ready to absorb truth all in the immediate. It is precisely against Fichte and his truth adequate to the certainty of the system that Hegel develops this splitting of certainty, which is consciousness, of not yet being a certainty as the reality in truth. This splitting and this mediation characterizes self-consciousness, which thus allows certainty to reveal itself in what is incomplete about it, in what is beyond itself, which allows it, in a word, to tend towards the truth. With self-consciousness, we have entered the native land of truth. The mere consciousness of certainty is not yet truth. It is even still only certainty of certainty. A doubling which risks leaving us locked in an indefinite game of certainties. Self-consciousness manifests itself first in the immediate, and this immediacy is still certainty. But it is certainty of certainty as something incomplete, like the empty mind. That is to say, that the negative side of certainty appears, or rather that in becoming certainty of itself, it reveals its own negativity. The immediate is immediate for whom mediation which suppresses it. It takes the form of the suppressed being and thereby detaches itself from the consciousness which thinks it. Objectivity reveals itself as constituted, and it is of this that Hegel writes, objectivity is now only worth as a superficial layer whose interior and essence are self-consciousness itself. It is in detachment through negativity that certainty becomes truth, because consciousness knows what its object is for itself, and what it is to its object. Truth is therefore not a new way of relating to the same object, nor even more so the same way of relating to a new object. It is the knowledge of the relationship that consciousness has always had with this object. With it, we pass from disappearing certainty to universality, which explains the apparent paradox of a truth, which is never founded on certainty, which, however, surpasses and encompasses it. The field of certainty is narrower than that of truth, and it is only because my certainty has risen to the level of truth that I can be conscious of others. At the level of certainty, I am only conscious of myself, but that immediate consciousness of myself rises to truth, and then my own being for itself presents itself to consciousness as an independent object. Immediately, the problem takes on a dimension in the very name of the system, which requires a passage from the immediate to the mediation of self-consciousness, because we can ask ourselves what credit should be given to this passage from certainty to truth. If we are able to give the status to truth to this passage, then it is not enough to say how the truth is constituted. Rather, we must still explain why this constitution is true. Despite the more numerous detours of the Hegelian conception, the difficulty is the same as that which we oppose to Fichte. The system risks having no other truth than that which it itself constitutes. The passage from certainty to truth cannot itself be based on a certainty because the destiny of certainty is revealed itself as incomplete, to call itself a truth, because also the system presupposes, in order to express a mind that has become conscious of itself. If we can denounce the transformation of a certainty into truth, it is because this passage was carried out so well that from the truth we were able to rise to self-consciousness of truth. The passage is presented in the mode of self-consciousness, in the mode, therefore, of certainty transformed into truth. It is therefore admitting that certainty is true of the whole truth, of the whole system, that at the very heart of certainty, there is a truth which is inherent to this certainty. Would the system not therefore be rigged at the base, which would admit in the certainty which is the basis of truth, this already constituted truth? In fact, the truth of this passage from certainty to truth is enclosed in certainty, not as a foreign element, but as the very way in which it presents itself to consciousness. It is not the truth conceptually thought, but the consciousness with which is truly certain, but the true certainty which is at the same time the pain of being only certainty. The only truth that the system allows itself to think in what it is not yet the truth is that always confused and always implicit of life. It's the truth of destiny, which is found at the level of certainty, which is more than the certainty, which is the tragic destiny of being in oneself and for oneself. It is the painful awareness of one's essentiality which is lost. In this pain, all distinction between truth and certainty melts. Their dissociation is not subtly hidden. It has not yet come. Even at the level of life, however, even in this field of purely possible implications, the problem of truth arises again. For beyond pain, making it possible for the system to think this pain, there is the knowledge of this pain as an expression of certainty. The knowledge that pain is absence, nostalgia for truth. At all levels of the system, without any being able to escape it, the problem of knowledge can and must arise, which immediately entails that of truth. There is no possible knowledge except this ether, which is the pure recognition of oneself and the absolute being other. That is to say, in truth. It is not possible to reserve a place in the system for misfortune of immediate consciousness without transforming it into true knowledge of this true pain. This truth is the very truth of the constituted system which flows back on its constituent moments. This truth of the whole system is not subject to the same difficulties as the truth of the Fichtean system. Hegel does not admit the postulate that the system is true because it forms a whole, which puts on the same level the immediacy of the first principle and the immediately conceived completion. If the system is true of the truth to which it leads, it is because it makes possible for consciousness a development which elevates it to the point of being a self-conscious spirit. What makes possible the effective reality, Wirklichkeit of truth, in absolute knowledge is true by that very fact. Hegel makes room for a system for the consciousness which thinks its system, which elevates itself to it. Hegel also escapes the reproach which could be made of Fichte of closing his system to any possibility of elevating itself to it. The Fichtean position is reversed. It is not because the whole exists and is true that the parts are true. It is because the parts have led to the whole that they have a truth, which also leads to the truth of the whole. Ultimately, the conceptual truth, that is to say, self-conscious truth, belongs not as such to the moments of the system, but only to the knowledge of the moments. It is this dissociation which explains that in the constituted system, certainty remains certainty, and that it is conceptual truth only external to itself for the philosopher who thinks it. The Hegelian system, far from being a means of forming a totality on itself, of making it acquire an autonomy where it founds for itself its own truth, rather, its system reveals itself as a principle of dissociation. This principle of dissociation, in striving through the mediation of its pain to attain total truth, and justifying as moments of truth its errors and its misfortunes as stages of happiness, consciousness arrives at its truth of consciousness of itself, which allows it only to think its efforts to constitute the system of its errors. In Fichte, the moment of the whole became true, the parts were also true. In Hegel, the path taken to arrive at the system remains, with its mirages and its pains. The truth of the whole flows back only on its knowledge of this path and its real meaning. Is therefore in Hegel not as such that the consciousness becomes absolute knowledge, but rather as soon as it reaches this stage, it dissociates itself to become knowledge of itself, of its history, of its limits, of its different figures. Truth in Hegel is not suddenly illuminated, but it holds the light by which the darkness will be illuminated. The truth of the development of consciousness in Hegel therefore imposes a phenomenology which realizes necessary dissociation of absolute knowledge. To judge Hegel in Hegelian terms, one can say that it was Hegel's misfortune to have had, once absolute knowledge was reached, to write a phenomenology which was the true knowledge of this march to knowledge, the truth of this effort towards truth.